Lila's seemingly perfect life is shattered when she uncovers a web of lies her husband, David, has been weaving for years. What starts as a simple affair turns into a dangerous game of deceit, betrayal, and high-stakes corruption. As Lila digs deeper, she discovers David's involvement in illegal dealings that threaten everything she holds dear. With her world collapsing around her, Lila faces an impossible choice: expose the truth and risk everything, or walk away from the destruction David has caused. Will she uncover the full extent of his betrayal, or will the consequences be too much to handle? The year was 2017, the city Charleston, South Carolina, a picturesque place where cobblestone streets and historic mansions told stories of centuries past. It was the kind of city that seemed frozen in time, with its oak trees draped in Spanish moss and the scent of the sea carried by every breeze. And yet, in the middle of all that charm, my life was anything but idyllic. I was married to David. Handsome, charismatic, the kind of man who could make anyone feel like the center of the universe. He had that magnetic quality that drew people in, a mix of southern charm and undeniable confidence. When we met, I was completely swept off my feet. He was everything I thought I wanted. Our life together, at least on the outside, was perfect. A charming house on a quiet street, a golden retriever named Max, and careers that allowed us to comfortably enjoy life's finer things. But perfection has a funny way of hiding cracks, doesn't it? David's job as a financial advisor kept him busy. Too busy. In fact, long hours at the office, business trips that seemed to crop up at a moment's notice, and client dinners that stretched late into the night. I told myself it was just part of the job, that his ambition was what made him so successful. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a quiet voice I worked hard to ignore. It wasn't just his absence that unsettled me. It was the little things. The way he had started keeping his phone face down on the counter, the sudden influx of late-night emails, and the cologne I didn't recognize lingering on his shirts. When I asked about it, he laughed it off, calling me paranoid. "Sweetheart, you've been reading too many of those crime novels," he'd say with that dazzling smile of his, and for a while, I let it go. After all, trust was the foundation of our relationship, wasn't it? Then came the dinner party. David had insisted we host a gathering for some of his work colleagues. It was nothing new. We entertained often. But something about this night felt different. He seemed unusually on edge, checking his watch every few minutes and stepping away to take calls in hushed tones. I spent the afternoon preparing, making sure the house looked immaculate and the food was perfect. David had always taken pride in our ability to impress, and I wanted everything to be just right. As the guests arrived, he slipped effortlessly into his role as host, laughing and chatting as if nothing was amiss. I tried to ignore the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept darting to the door. Maybe he was just stressed. The evening unfolded smoothly. At first, the wine flowed. The conversation was lively, and the room buzzed with energy. I found myself laughing at a joke one of David's co-workers told, momentarily forgetting my unease. But then she arrived. She was stunning, in a way that made me instantly feel inadequate. Long dark hair, red lipstick that seemed to command attention, and a confidence that filled the room the moment she walked in. David's reaction was immediate. His entire demeanor shifted. He stood a little taller, his smile a little wider. "This is Lauren," he said, introducing her as a new hire at his firm. She smiled politely, but her eyes said something else, something that made my chest tighten. I tried to shake it off. She was just a colleague, nothing more. But as the night went on, I couldn't help but notice the way their interactions felt too familiar. A shared laugh, a lingering glance, the way his hand brushed hers when he handed her a glass of wine. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to me it was glaringly obvious. I excused myself, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of checking on dessert. My hands trembled as I adjusted the plates, Trying to steady my breath, I told myself I was being ridiculous. David loved me. He had chosen me. But when I returned to the dining room, the scene that greeted me confirmed what I had been too afraid to admit. Lauren was leaning in close to David, her hand resting on his arm. He wasn't pulling away. In fact, he seemed to lean into her touch, his smile softer than the one he'd given me all night. My heart sank. I spent the rest of the evening on autopilot, smiling and chatting as if everything was fine. But inside, I felt like I was unraveling. When the last guest finally left and the door clicked shut, I turned to David, my voice trembling. "Who is she, really?" He froze, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Lauren, don't play dumb, David. I saw the way you looked at her." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're overreacting. She's just a colleague." "Just a colleague?" I snapped, the anger I had been suppressing all night finally spilling over. "Then why did you act like she was the only person in the room?" David didn't respond right away. Instead, he poured himself another glass of wine, avoiding my gaze. "You're being paranoid," he said finally, his tone dismissive. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you should take a step back and stop overthinking everything." His words stung, but what hurt more was the way he refused to meet my eyes. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew something was wrong. The man I had married, the man I thought I knew, was slipping away from me. And Lauren, whoever she was at the center of it all. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us grew. David's excuses became more frequent, his temper shorter. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. I tried to confront him again, but he always found a way to deflect, accusing me of being insecure or imagining things. "You're letting your imagination run wild," he'd say, planting a kiss on my forehead before heading out the door. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. It wasn't until I found the receipt that everything began to unravel. I had been cleaning out the car when I came across it, a crumpled piece of paper tucked under the passenger seat. A receipt for a hotel room, dated 2 weeks ago. David had told me he was out of town for a conference that weekend. I stared at the receipt, my hands trembling. My mind raced, 1,000 scenarios playing out all at once. When he came home that night, I confronted him, holding the receipt like it was a weapon. "Care to explain this?" His face went pale. For the first time, he didn't have a ready answer. I pressed on, my voice shaking with anger and heartbreak. "Who were you with, David? Don't lie to me." But the lie came anyway, as smooth and practiced as ever. "It's not what you think." I didn't believe him. Not this time. David's silence that night was deafening. He didn't deny the receipt outright, but he didn't explain it either. Instead, he muttered something about work and went upstairs, leaving me standing in the kitchen, clutching the slip of paper like it was evidence in a trial. And in a way, it was. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Days passed with little more than surface-level conversations. "Pass the salt," or "Did you let Max out?" It felt like we were roommates instead of husband and wife. I wasn't going to let it go, though. The receipt, Lauren, the late nights, every piece of the puzzle screamed at me to dig deeper. One evening, while David was in the shower, I gave in to my suspicions and reached for his phone. It was locked, of course, but a part of me had expected that. What I didn't expect was the vibration of an incoming text. Lauren's name lit up the screen. I stared at it, my heart pounding. The message was short. "Same time tomorrow?" I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. When David came downstairs, I confronted him again, this time with the text as my weapon. "Are you seeing her?" I demanded. Holding the phone up, his face shifted from shock to anger. "You went through my phone?" "Don't turn this around on me, David. I snapped. Answer the question. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Lauren is just a colleague. She needed my help with some personal matters. You're blowing this out of proportion. Personal matters like booking hotel rooms together? His jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer for that, and his silence spoke louder than any excuse he could have made. The weeks that followed were a blur of arguments and cold shoulders. I couldn't trust him anymore, but I also couldn't bring myself to leave. I felt trapped in the life we'd built together, a life that now felt like a house of cards teetering on the brink of collapse. It wasn't until I decided to follow him that everything came to a head. One Friday night, David told me he had another late meeting. The same excuse he'd used countless times before, but this time, instead of staying home and waiting, I grabbed my keys and followed him. He drove across town to a small boutique hotel. My heart raced as I watched him park and walk inside. After a few minutes, Lauren appeared, stepping out of a cab and heading straight into the lobby. I didn't know what to do. My hands trembled as I sat in the car, watching the door. The confirmation I had dreaded for so long was right in front of me, and yet I felt paralyzed. Finally, I summoned the courage to go inside. My chest was tight, my breath shallow as I approached the front desk. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm looking for my husband, David Carter. He checked in earlier." The receptionist hesitated, glancing at the computer screen. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't give out guest information." "Please," I pressed, my voice breaking. "It's important." She looked at me for a long moment before nodding slightly. "He's in room 214. I made my way to the second floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure if I could face what was on the other side. But then I heard laughter. A woman's laughter, light and familiar. My stomach churned. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing in the silent hallway. The door opened, and there he was, standing in front of me, his shirt untucked and his face a mix of shock and guilt. Behind him, Lauren stood frozen, her expression one of pure panic. "Lila," David stammered. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer, and I didn't wait for one. I turned on my heel and walked away, tears streaming down my face as I left the hotel. That night, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend. I didn't tell David where I was going, and I didn't answer his calls or texts. I needed space to think, to figure out what my next move would be. The following morning, I met with a lawyer. As I sat across from her, recounting everything that had happened, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a small glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life without David. The lawyer was kind, but firm. She explained my options, laying out a plan that would protect me financially and legally. It was a lot to take in, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my life. When I returned home later that day, David was waiting for me. He looked disheveled, his eyes red as if he hadn't slept. "Lila, we need to talk," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I have nothing to say to you," I replied, pushing past him. "Please," he pleaded, following me into the living room. "I know I messed up, I know I hurt you. But can't we at least try to fix this?" I turned to face him, my eyes narrowing. "Fix this? You've been lying to me for months, David. You've been sneaking around with her behind my back. How do you expect me to fix something you've already destroyed?" He looked at me, his face crumbling. "Because I still love you." The words hung in the air, heavy with desperation, but they didn't have the effect he hoped for. "Love?" I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have betrayed me. You wouldn't have made me question everything we've built together." He didn't respond. Instead, He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But it wasn't enough to erase what he had done. "I'm filing for divorce," I said finally, my voice steady. "And I think it's best if you leave." David looked up at me, his eyes filled with pain. "Lila, please don't do this." But I had already made up my mind. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, starting over with just the essentials. It was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Looking back, I realized that David's betrayal wasn't just about Lauren. It was about the cracks in our relationship that had been there all along, cracks we both ignored until they became impossible to fix. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is walk away. But sometimes, it's the only way to find yourself again. If you're still here, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and provoke thought. The weeks following my decision to file for divorce were a whirlwind. Every day felt like a battle, a tug of war between anger, heartbreak, and the faint hope that life could eventually feel normal again. David, to his credit, or maybe his detriment, refused to let me go quietly. He sent flowers, left voicemails full of apologies, and even showed up at my new apartment one evening, begging for a second chance. His words were desperate, but they were also hollow. "Lila, I made a mistake," he said, his voice breaking as he stood in my doorway. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't lose you. Please, let me prove that I can be the man you fell in love with." I stood there, arms crossed, blocking the threshold like it was the only thing holding me together. "David, the man I fell in love with wouldn't have done this to me. You already lost me the moment you decided to lie." He started to say something else, but I shut the door before he could finish. Still, even as I tried to move forward, the past had a way of clinging to me. The memories of our life together, the good ones and the bad, played like a loop in my mind. And Lauren, that shadowy figure who had inserted herself into my marriage, remained an unanswered question. I thought I had seen the worst of it. I thought the hotel room confrontation was the lowest point. But I was wrong. A week later, I received an email. The subject line read, "You deserve the truth." The sender was anonymous, but the contents were anything but vague. Attached to the email were dozens of screenshots, text messages between David and Lauren. They weren't just flirting or planning secret meetings, they were plotting. In one exchange, Lauren asked him, "When are you going to tell her about us?" David's response made my stomach turn. "Soon, just waiting for the right moment. I need her to stay calm until the business deal goes through." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated betrayal. David had been using me as a pawn, stringing me along while he and Lauren schemed behind my back. The betrayal hit like a sledgehammer. The man I thought I knew, the man I had built my life around, had been lying to me on every possible level. Fueled by a mix of fury and determination, I printed every screenshot and brought them to my lawyer. "These are going to help," she said, her voice steady. "Not just in the divorce proceedings, but in making sure he doesn't get away with whatever else he's planning." That was the moment everything shifted. I stopped feeling like a victim and started taking back control. The first step was confronting David, not in the privacy of a quiet room, but in a setting where his mask of charm couldn't protect him. A few days later, David had invited mutual friends to dinner, likely in another attempt to paint himself as the doting husband trying to save our marriage. What he didn't know was that I was about to turn the tables. I arrived at the restaurant early, taking a seat near the back where I could observe without being seen. The plan was simple: wait for the right moment and then expose him for who he truly was. When David and our friends arrived, he greeted them with his usual charisma, laughing and joking as if he hadn't destroyed my life. Lauren wasn't there, of course she wouldn't be, but her absence didn't make the sting of betrayal any less sharp. As they ordered drinks, I made my move, stepping out of the shadows and walking to their table. "Lila," one of our friends said, her eyes wide with surprise. "We didn't know you'd be here." David's face froze, the color draining as he realized I wasn't there to play nice. "I wasn't invited," I said calmly, pulling the printed screenshots from my bag, "but I thought I'd stop by to share a little story." I laid the papers on the table, each one a piece of evidence in the case against him. David tried to grab them, but I held firm. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady. "Explain to everyone here why you've been lying, not just to me, but to all of us." The table fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in one by one. Our friends picked up the papers, their expressions shifting from confusion to disgust as they read. "David," one of them said, her voice sharp, "what the hell is this?" He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but there was no way out. I didn't stay to hear his half-hearted apologies. I walked out of the restaurant, my head held high, leaving him to deal with the mess he had created. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was swift. Word of David's betrayal spread through our social circles, and his once spotless reputation began to crumble. Lauren disappeared from his life, or so he claimed. But by then, it didn't matter. I finalized the divorce, ensuring that I came out of it with my finances and dignity intact. But the real victory wasn't in what I gained, or what David lost. It was in reclaiming my sense of self, my independence, and my ability to move forward without him. The experience changed me in ways I didn't expect. It forced me to confront, not just the lies in my marriage, but the lies I had been telling myself, that everything was fine, that love was enough, that I didn't deserve more. Now, as I sit in my new apartment, writing this story, I realize that sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away. But sometimes, it's the only way to find yourself again. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Remember, every ending is a chance for a new beginning. The days following my confrontation with David at the restaurant were a blur. The phone calls, the texts, the pleading. He tried everything he could to get me to take him back. He begged for forgiveness, claimed he was sorry, that it had all been a mistake, but I was done. I'd seen the truth laid bare before me, and there was no going back. But that didn't make things easy. No matter how many times I told myself I was better off without him, the loneliness crept in, especially when I saw all the empty spaces in my apartment. Spaces that used to be filled with his presence, with his lies. I had to remind myself why I was doing this. He didn't deserve my forgiveness. He didn't deserve another chance. Yet in those quiet moments, when I wasn't busy with work or trying to keep my mind occupied, the anger and heartbreak surged, threatening to overwhelm me. How could someone who claimed to love me betray me so completely? How could he look me in the eyes, day after day, and pretend everything was fine when all along he was with her? I had my answer, though, in the form of a letter I received a few days after the restaurant confrontation. It wasn't from David. It wasn't from anyone I knew. It was a letter addressed to me, written in a familiar, neat handwriting. I tore it open, the anxiety knotting in my chest. The message inside read, "I hope you know that everything David has done, everything he's told you, has been a lie. You've only seen the tip of the iceberg." My heart raced as I continued to read. I know this is hard to hear, but if you want the full truth, I'm the one who can give it to you. David's been hiding something much darker than an affair. He's been playing both sides for years, and it's not just about you or Lauren, it's about something far more dangerous. Don't let him fool you anymore. The letter was unsigned, but the words hit me like a punch in the gut. What was this person talking about? David's secrets. Something darker. I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter. The implications were clear. There was more to the story. More than I had realized. I had already uncovered so much betrayal. So many lies. But this was something else entirely. I had to know the truth. The next day, I set out to uncover what David had been hiding. I didn't know where to start, but the letter had mentioned something important. Don't let him fool you anymore. I thought about that phrase all night. If there was one thing David had done, it was fool me. He'd built an entire life of lies around me, and I had been too blinded by love, or maybe too afraid of the truth to see it. I started with what I knew best, his work. The company he had been involved with for years had always seemed above reproach. But what if that wasn't the case? What if it was all part of a larger web of deception? I reached out to a friend who worked at the company, someone I knew I could trust. Her name was Megan, and she had been David's co-worker for a long time. When I called her, she was hesitant at first, but after a few minutes of gentle coaxing, she agreed to meet. When we sat down, Megan didn't mince words. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Lila," she said, her voice low. "David's been involved in some pretty shady deals, and Lauren is more than just an affair partner. She's part of it. They've been running a side business, a completely separate operation, and it's illegal." My stomach dropped. Illegal? What do you mean? Megan hesitated, looking around as if making sure no one could overhear. "I can't give you all the details, but I can tell you this much. The company's been laundering money. They've been funneling cash through accounts in other countries, making it look like legitimate transactions. David's at the center of it all." I sat there, stunned. I'd known David had ambition. But this was a betrayal of a magnitude I couldn't have imagined. Not only had he been unfaithful to me, but he had been committing crimes, and worse, using me as a shield to keep his secrets safe. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to take action," Megan replied. "If this gets out, it's not just his career that's on the line. You'll be dragged into it too. You have to get ahead of this before it spirals out of control." I nodded, my mind racing. The stakes were higher than I had ever anticipated, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about ending my marriage. This was about exposing the truth and protecting myself. The next few days were a whirlwind. Megan had given me some leads, documents, contacts, and even a few encrypted files that David had stored on his work computer. It felt like I was slowly peeling back the layers of his life, revealing a side of him I never knew existed. As I dug deeper, I discovered more about the criminal operation David had been involved in. It was bigger than I had imagined. High-level corruption, fraudulent contracts, and money laundering that extended far beyond just his company. It was a well-oiled machine, and David was its key player. At that point, I knew I had two choices. I could confront him again, demanding he end everything, or I could use the evidence I had gathered to expose him once and for all. But something in me snapped. I couldn't let him off the hook. Not anymore. Not after everything he'd done to me. The confrontation came the following week. I waited until David was home from work, and then walked into the living room where he was sitting, as calm and composed as ever. "Lila, you look upset," he said, trying to feign concern. "Upset?" I repeated, stepping forward. "Oh, I'm beyond upset, David. I know everything I know about the money laundering, the offshore accounts, the side business you've been running with Lauren. I know everything, and it's time for you to face the consequences." His face turned pale. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me as if trying to process the words. "You don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, his voice shaking. "Don't try to lie to me, David. I have all the proof I need, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are. This isn't just an affair anymore. You've been hiding crimes, and I'm not going to protect you." His eyes widened, panic setting in. "Lila, please. We can fix this, I swear. I never wanted you to get involved in any of this." I took a step forward, the anger boiling inside me. "You didn't care what I wanted, David. You never did. You only cared about yourself. Now you'll pay the price." His face twisted in desperation. "You can't do this. You'll ruin us both. Please, Lila, don't take this to the authorities." I stared at him for a long moment, my heart heavy, but my resolve stronger than ever. "You're already ruined. I'm just making sure everyone else knows the truth." I walked out of the room, leaving him standing there in his self-made prison, watching as everything he had built came crashing down around him. The moment I left David standing in the living room, the weight of everything hit me all at once. I had just torn apart the life I had spent so many years building. But as I stood there, listening to the echoes of my own footsteps in the hallway, a strange sense of empowerment began to take root. This wasn't just about David anymore. It wasn't even about Lauren or the affair. It was about me, about reclaiming my life, my voice, and the control I had lost. David had built his empire of lies on my silence, and now I was finally speaking the truth. I didn't look back as I walked out of the front door. I had made up my mind, and there was no turning back. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal advice. I had gathered all the evidence I needed: the emails, the text messages, the records of financial transactions. I felt like I was watching everything unfold from a distance, as if I were observing someone else's life. It was surreal, to be honest. The woman who had once believed in love above all else, who had trusted her husband with everything, was now standing on the edge of something much bigger than herself. And the worst part, I didn't even know what would happen next. Would David try to fight back? Would Lauren come after me? The stakes were rising, and the uncertainty was suffocating. But one thing was for sure: I wasn't backing down. It wasn't just the affair I was trying to expose anymore. It was the web of corruption and lies that had ensnared everyone around me. David's empire was built on deceit, and I would make sure it crumbled. David tried to contact me constantly. Texts, phone calls, even showing up at my office. But I refused to engage. Every time I saw his name on my phone, I turned it off. I couldn't let him manipulate me again. Then, one afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. I was sitting at my desk, going over the evidence once more, when I heard a knock at the door. I looked up, expecting it to be one of my colleagues, but when I opened it, I found someone I wasn't expecting. It was Lauren. For a moment I froze. She was standing there, looking like she had all the confidence in the world, but I could see the nervousness in her eyes, despite her calm demeanor. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady, but not as firm as she probably intended. I didn't invite her in. I simply leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "I'm not interested in whatever you have to say, Lauren. I know this looks bad," she said, stepping forward. "But it's not what you think. I never meant for things to go this far." I raised an eyebrow. "You never meant for things to go this far? You really think I'm going to buy that?" She bit her lip, clearly frustrated. "Look, I didn't come here to fight with you. I came because I want to explain David. I didn't know what he was really doing. I didn't know how deep it all went. He lied to me, just like he lied to you." I felt my chest tighten, a rush of anger boiling up. "So now you're the victim? You think that's what I need to hear?" Lauren seemed taken aback by my harsh tone. "I'm not trying to make excuses, okay? I'm just trying to tell you that I didn't know about the money laundering. About everything else, I'm not part of that." I was skeptical, but there was something about her words that made me hesitate. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted to hear her side, to see if it could offer me any kind of closure. But I couldn't let myself get swayed. You think that makes everything better? You think that changes what happened between me and David? I said, my voice shaking with frustration. You both lied to me. You both betrayed me in the worst possible way. Lauren's eyes softened, and I saw something in them. Guilt. Maybe even regret. I know. And I'm sorry I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know the truth. David was playing us both. He's been playing both of us for years. I shook my head, the weight of everything hitting me again. You should have known better. You had every chance to walk away, but you didn't, and neither did he. So don't expect me to feel sorry for you. Lauren didn't answer. She just stood there, her shoulders sagging, defeated. After a long silence, she finally spoke again. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Lila. But you need to know that David's not the man you think he is. If you go public with everything, he won't just lose his job. He'll lose everything. He'll destroy you too. The warning sent a chill down my spine. The stakes were higher than I realized. This wasn't just about taking down David anymore. This was about surviving what was coming next. That night, I went over everything again. The evidence, the conversations, the promises David had made to me that had all been lies. It was time. I had already decided that I would go public. Reveal everything. But as I sat there, alone in my apartment, I wondered what would happen next. Would David retaliate? Would I be able to survive this? The next morning, I made the call. I had scheduled a meeting with a journalist I knew. A friend of a friend who specialized in corporate corruption stories. I had everything I needed. The proof, the contacts, and the desire to expose the truth. But as I walked into that meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even worse. You ready? My journalist friend asked, her eyes scanning me carefully. I have no choice, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This ends now. She nodded and motioned for me to sit. Then let's do it. The days following the meeting felt like a blur. My story was picked up by multiple outlets, and soon, David's name was all over the news. The corruption, the lies, and the money laundering. Everything was out in the open. David, of course, denied everything. He tried to cover his tracks, but the evidence was too strong. The walls were closing in. The tension was unbearable. I watched as everything David had built came crashing down, and part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the life I had once believed in. I thought the worst was over, but I was wrong. That evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I received a call from an unknown number. I picked up, my hand shaking. It's David, a voice said on the other end. My heart skipped a beat. I just wanted to tell you that you've made a mistake, he continued. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. You've only just started the game. His words sent a cold shiver down my spine. What had I just unleashed? The moment I heard David's voice on the phone, something deep inside me shifted. The calm, collected version of myself I had been for weeks, distant, deliberate, was replaced by a surge of raw emotion. I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. You think you've won, don't you? David's voice was cold, almost mocking. You've exposed me, but you've only scratched the surface, Lila. You don't even know what you've gotten yourself into. His words echoed through the quiet apartment, his threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I took a shaky breath. What are you talking about, David? He laughed, the sound sharp and menacing. You think destroying me will be your victory. You think this ends with me losing my job, my reputation. No, Lila. This is bigger than that. I still have connections, people who owe me. You've made a powerful enemy. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as he continued, his voice seeping with venom. This is just the beginning. You've opened a door you can't close. With that, he hung up. I stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, the weight of his words sinking in. My first instinct was fear. Fear of what he might do next. But then, something else clicked into place. He was trying to scare me. He was trying to get inside my head. And I wasn't going to let him. No matter what came next, I wasn't backing down. The next few days were a blur of anxious energy. I could feel the tension mounting, both around me and within myself. I spent hours researching every move David had made, trying to uncover more about the network he was part of, trying to anticipate what he might do next. His threat hung in the air like a sword over my head, and every knock on my door, every unfamiliar car driving by, made my heart race. Then came the first real sign that David's words weren't just empty threats. I was at work when I received an email from an unknown address. It was simple, just a link to a video. My stomach dropped as I clicked on it, unsure of what I was about to see. The video began with a grainy image of me, walking down the street after one of my meetings. At first, I didn't understand why it was significant, until I saw the car in the background, slowly following me. The footage wasn't clear, but there was no mistaking the implication someone had been tailing me. I felt the blood drain from my face as the realization hit David hadn't just threatened me. He was making good on those threats. He had eyes everywhere. And now, he was watching me. I immediately called the police, but they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. My lawyer urged me to stay calm, to keep my distance from David as much as possible. But with every passing day, I could feel the walls closing in. He was always one step ahead, always ready to push me into a corner. The following week, I decided I needed to confront David. One last time, I had no intention of reconciling, of course. But the pressure of the unknown was unbearable. I needed to hear him say it. That he was the one pulling the strings, that he was responsible for the dangerous path I was on. I arranged to meet him at a cafe in the city, somewhere public where I could keep control of the situation. My heart hammered as I sat down at the small table, the air heavy with tension. I glanced around, feeling like every pair of eyes in the room was on me. When David walked in, he looked the same as always, well-dressed, confident. But there was something in his eyes, something darker that I couldn't place. He sat down across from me, his gaze fixed on mine. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, his voice cold, but tinged with something almost regretful. "Talk?" I asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of my tone. "After everything you've done, you have the nerve to talk to me?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to beg, Lila. I'm here to offer you something, a way out of all this." "A way out?" I repeated, incredulous. "You think I need a way out? You think I'm the one who's trapped here?" David glanced around the room before continuing, his voice barely a whisper. "You've gone public with the story, but I'm telling you, it's not over. You think your little expose is enough to destroy me. There are people who don't care about your morals, Lila. You've made an enemy of the wrong person, and now they're going to make you regret it." My chest tightened as he spoke. "Who are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking with both fear and fury. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat back in his chair, studying me with a look that made me feel like I was the one being hunted. "You don't want to know," he said simply. "But it's too late now. You've already crossed the line." I swallowed, my mind racing. The stakes had just gone from bad to worse. It wasn't just David anymore. It was the people he was involved with. People who didn't play by the rules. People who could destroy my life in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned in once more, his eyes locking onto mine. I want you to leave this alone. I want you to walk away, take your story down, and forget you ever uncovered what you did. If you do that, I'll make sure you stay out of it. You'll be safe. But if you don't— If I don't, I whispered, the threat hanging between us like a tangible thing. David smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was a smile that sent a shiver down my spine. You'll wish you had. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could feel every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, to get away from him before it was too late. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wasn't going to let him scare me anymore. No, I said, my voice steady for the first time. You've already lost. You can't take this back, and neither can I. David stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He gave me one last look, his eyes narrowing. You're making a huge mistake. I watched him walk away, the feeling of finality settling in. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But I also knew that there was no turning back. He could threaten me, manipulate me, and try to scare me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had already taken control of my life. I had already decided to fight back. The next few days were full of uneasy silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The truth had been exposed, but David and his connections weren't going to let it end without a fight. I just had to be ready for whatever was next. The weeks that followed David's ultimatum were tense and unpredictable. The world I had once known seemed to shift beneath my feet, with every new piece of information bringing me closer to the inevitable fallout. But the more I learned about David's dealings, the more I realized that there was no turning back. I had exposed the lies, and now I had to see this through, no matter what the cost. David's threats became more desperate. He started showing up at my apartment uninvited, sending texts, and even calling late at night, warning me to stop or face the consequences. But I stayed firm, refusing to give in. The deeper I delved into the corruption he was involved in, the clearer it became that he had to be stopped, and I wouldn't let fear guide my decisions anymore. But then, one day, everything changed. I received a call from my lawyer, her voice tight with urgency. Lila, you need to get down to the office right away. There's been a development. I rushed over, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, my lawyer didn't waste time. David's people, his connections, they're moving fast. We've just received word that the authorities have been investigating his financial dealings for months. Your whistleblowing may have accelerated the investigation, but now it's out of your hands. They're coming for him. Relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. I had exposed the truth. But at what cost? Would I ever be able to move on from everything that had happened? I wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. David's world was crumbling, and there was no place for me in it anymore. Days later, David was arrested. The news spread like wildfire. His fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. His illegal operations, his deceit, and the manipulation of so many people. Everything came to light. And as much as part of me wanted to revel in his downfall, another part of me couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. I had loved this man. I had built my life with him. And now, everything we had created was gone. As for Lauren, she, too, disappeared from the scene. While I never received an apology from her, I didn't need one. The damage was done, and now it was about survival. I was finally free to move forward, to rebuild my life on my own terms. Months passed, and life began to slowly fall back into place. I spent time with friends and family who had supported me throughout the ordeal, reconnecting with the parts of myself that had been lost in the chaos. I took up new hobbies, enrolled in a writing class I had always wanted to join, and started thinking about my future. Not the one I had imagined with David, but the one I would create for myself. The process wasn't easy. There were days when the pain resurfaced, when I would catch myself wondering what could have been, what might have happened if things had gone differently. But I had learned something crucial through all of this. I was stronger than I had ever realized. I had faced the worst betrayal anyone could experience. And I had come out the other side. Not just surviving, but thriving. And then, one evening, I stood at my window, staring out at the city. It was a quiet night. The kind that made you appreciate the simple peace of being alone. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. The person who had entered this journey full of doubt and pain was no longer the same. I had become someone who was capable of handling whatever came my way. Someone who had learned to trust herself above all else. The scars would remain, but they were no longer something I ran from. They were part of me, part of my story, and I was no longer ashamed of them. As the years went by, the memory of David and the chaos he brought into my life began to fade. Though the lessons I had learned stayed with me, I eventually moved on, dating again, but never rushing into anything. I had learned that my own happiness was something I needed to cultivate, not depend on someone else to give me. And as for David, he served his time, facing the consequences of his actions. But I knew that he would never truly pay for the damage he had caused, not in the way that mattered. The truth had come to light, and that was enough. The real victory was in walking away, in choosing my own path, and in finally understanding that I deserved better. The final moments of the story were not dramatic or filled with grand gestures. They were quiet, peaceful moments of reflection. I had faced my fears, uncovered the truth, and emerged stronger than ever. The pain would always be part of me, but it no longer had control over me. I had taken back the power I had given away. As I sat there, looking out at the skyline, I thought about how far I had come. From a woman betrayed, shattered, unsure of herself, to someone who had rediscovered her strength and her purpose. It was a hard journey, but it was mine, and in the end, it had shaped me into the person I was always meant to be. And so, this story comes to a close. It's a story of betrayal, resilience, and the power of reclaiming your life after everything has fallen apart. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey may be, the strength to move forward lies within us all. Thanks for following along with this story. If you've enjoyed it, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, every ending is just the beginning of something new.